All right. Well, hey everyone. So my name's Shuen, also known as Lin Chalice on MTGO. Um, I've recorded this video probably 100 times now, but I'm just so bad at public speaking and remembering what I want to say that I've decided I'm just gonna wing it and kind of have a podcast or discussion type presentation for this video. So this is just gonna be kind of a primer on Yorion Thieves. I think I've been trying to work on this for a bit. It started off as just being a text guide, but it was a giant wall of text. I didn't think anyone would ever be interested in reading any of it, and I really wanted to put something out there because I think the deck is pretty intimidating. And for people who are new to the deck, I remember when I picked this deck up, it was basically the fastest 0-3 I've ever had. So yeah, well, without much ado, let's get right into it. So stuff we'll talk about today, some brief introductions. I'll talk a little bit about the aims I have for this primer. And then we'll have a little bit of a juxtaposition of this deck with some of the other control decks. We'll have some math, like boring stuff, I guess. So the first part of this primer is going to be mostly on theory and how we got to the numbers we got to. And we'll have some stuff relating to the deck construction. And for part two, obviously, we're going to be talking about the cards we play, why we play certain cards, why they're good, and we'll talk about the sideboard construction as well. So that part's going to be a lot more relating to what kind of cards can I play, what stuff I have in my deck, and our roles, I guess, in certain matchups, stuff like that. And then finally, we'll have FAQs and maybe useful resources. I don't have anything in there right now, but yeah. All right, well, so aims, like I said, I've been working on this primer for a while. I think I've tried my best to basically put this into an easily consumable or hopefully easily consumable video so that you can kind of watch and do something else on the side. I wanted this to be kind of I guess beginner friendly to people who just don't play the deck, or maybe you're coming from Snoko or some other blue deck, or maybe you don't play blue at all and you saw this deck and you were like, wow, that's really cool. So yeah, I wanted to be able to teach people who are new to the deck, and I want to equip people with kind of ways to make informed decisions when you build the deck eventually, because as you know, most of the people playing this deck play on Magic Online. It's me and Chase mostly, and I think it can be easy to copy paste the R75 or 95, I guess, from MTG Goldfish, but then you're stuck with weird options like, well, why is there opposition agent in my sideboard, or why is there no opposition agent, or I really wanted to collect your oof because 5 people in my local game store play Urza Stompy. So stuff like that, I hope I'll be able to address. And if you don't play on Magic Online, it's really nice to be able to understand the reasoning behind why the deck was built a certain way. And of course, this kind of leads into how to sideboard as well, right? Like, if you know why a card is in the sideboard, you'll know when you have to bring it in. All right, well, cool. So I guess the first part of this will kind of go into comparing Yorion Thieves or Stryfo Pile to Snoko. So a lot of people ask this question really often: is Stryfo Pile a snow deck? And I think in a very strict sense, it kind of is, right? It plays a bunch of snow-covered lands. It plays Arcum's Astrolabe. It tries its best to leverage the mana fixing of Astrolabe to further your game plan. And I think it is one of the big benefits moving up from 60 to 80 cards, which we'll definitely discuss later on somewhere in the guide. But I think the fundamental difference between Thieves and Snow is that Snoko is a deck that relies on efficiency. So they play a lot of cantrips and ways to find the best possible cheap answer to what your opponent's doing. And by that, of course, I mean cards like Pyroblast, Swords to Plowshares, and Abrupt Decay. You basically spend the least amount of mana possible to answer your opponent's threats, and that lets you be very tempo positive while playing tempo negative cards. So cards like Astrolabe and Ponder. You can Ponder and Swords to Plowshares in exactly the same turn while still playing around days. That's why Snoko has such a good matchup against Delver, because it's super efficient. It's not really that clunky. And in that sense, it resembles Miracles a lot, right? You kind of a removal deck with some win conditions, and it's kind of glued together by the Xerox elements of the deck. Where Thieves is similar to Snoko, I think, is that they're both very engine-heavy control decks. And what I mean by that is, if you look at some of the earliest versions of Snoko, Anurag was one of the first players that I saw to play super heavily into this engine. I played Snoko from December of last year, but I never actually went for anything like this. And I remember when he top 8 this challenge in particular, he was playing just like 4 Uros and 3 libraries, and everyone was just like going crazy about how like insanely hard this deck leaned into this engine. And I think Thieves is pretty similar in that sense, because we have our own engine in Dak Vaden, Punishing Fire, and Grove of the Burn Willows, and they're both just kind of the same, right? You have your deck built, it's a bunch of stuff glued together, and your engine is your way to get card advantage in the long term. And of course, for our deck, Uro is obviously very good too, and Cling to Dust. We have a lot more like synergistic pieces, I guess, compared to Snoko, where Snoko is a lot more like compartmentalized, right? They have Swords to Plowshares. It does one thing. It does exactly what it needs to do for a super cheap cost. All right, moving on. So, I guess just to discuss Snow a little bit more. So I have quite a lot of reps in Snow. I used to play Snow a lot. Before the companions were printed, I played basically exclusively Snow. I played it when it was bad during Breach, and I still did fine. I 5-0'd pretty often. But yeah, so Snow is different from our deck in a sense that they play individually powerful cards. So when you look at a Snoko list and you look at their cards, they play Swords to Plowshares, Abrupt Decay, as I already said, Sylvan Library, Uro, Oko. Each card is standalone and very powerful for their mana cost. So they're very consistent at doing the same thing, and that's why you'll hear just people constantly complaining about how like Snoko just has 2 Force Wolves, or like turn 2 Sylvan Library, and then turn 3 Oko, turn 4 Uro, stuff like that. It's very consistent, but it plays very modal cards. And I guess like the deck is very compartmentalized. So it kind of wants to go through its deck and find the right pieces. And of course, their deck plays much better on Wasteland. They have like a billion basics, and because they're playing 60 cards, they're going to see Astrolabe super often. So it's not going to be easy for people to, get them off their mana. Whereas for our deck, I think we're different in the sense that we have less polarizing cards. And what I mean by that is you compare Assassin's Trophy to Drown in the Loch, for example. They're actually not that different, right? Like, Assassin's Trophy can kill anything. And Drown in the Loch is both a counterspell and a removal. But, like, overall, they're, like, pretty similar cards in the sense that if I played against combo, I'm usually okay with having either card in my hand. Whereas if you're playing Snoko and you draw like your Abrupt Decay when you're playing against combo, it literally has no text, which is like really terrible. And of course, one other benefit to playing Thieves is that your pair variety is very wide. I know there was a problem going on with Snoko like a couple of months ago when Delver players started realizing that, well, if I sit around and then I Surgical Uro and I Pyroblast all the Okos, my opponent actually just can't win the game because all they have is Icewind Kodals, especially after they cut all the Snapcaster mages. And this is a problem that, Snow obviously addressed eventually to start playing like Field of the Dead, Felidar Retreat, a bunch of other like fair cards that were less susceptible to Pyroblast and Surgical. But for our deck, we are even better at that, I think. Even though Surgical can be sometimes annoying, it's very difficult to surgical us out of the game because our threat density is like really wide. We have a lot of cards that matter a lot, I think, and that we don't actually board out even against Delver. And I think at its heart, if you think about Stryfo Pile as an engine control deck, it's not really a pile deck, right? If you compare it to the pile decks of old, stuff like Check Pile, that was a real pile deck because it played really powerful cards on their own. It played like a Hymn to Torak, it played Lightning Bolt, Fatal Push, what was it, a Deathrite Shaman, K command, they just had cards that were like individually very good, and they just kind of were all thrown into the same deck without much thought. But our deck is the opposite, right? We play cards that are actually slightly weaker on their own, but work together in a highly synergistic way, and that kind of makes the deck churn, through itself a lot, and that's why we have such a powerful engine in the late game compared to Snow. All right, so just to review what we went over, I know that was a lot to I just kind of talk about the difference between Snow and Thieves, but I do think that Snowco has some advantages over Stryfo Pile. It's much stronger over I guess like it has a much stronger control over the early game. So what I mean by that is because you're playing such efficient cards, you have like a reasonable amount of stat control in the early game, which I think is very valuable, especially against a deck like Delver. So if you think Delver is the best deck, or it's very popular where you play, or if you just think that a lot of people will be playing Delver, like Snowco is hands down the better deck against Delver. Of course, one other really strong thing about Snowco is that when you're not contested, and by that I mean if your opponent kept like a mopey hand that doesn't do anything, you actually win the game really quickly, because cards like Oko and Uro, they punch really hard really fast when you're ahead, and the deck is also really good at staying ahead because of cards like Sylvan Library. So yeah, I guess, and of course the one weakness is they have kind of small pool of threats. Pyroblast is usually pretty good against a deck, sometimes gets Surgical out of the game. And for our deck, the main deck cards are a lot more universal. So I think in general, I'm happier to play against combo playing Stryfo Pile compared to Snowco, because there are a lot more cards that have a lot more text. So Assassin's Trophy, for example, you can quote unquote wasteland your opponent or like sinkhole them out of the game. There are a lot of combo decks who don't really play that many basics. You can kill stuff like Omniscience. And cards like John the Lock are relevant in both fair and unfair matchups, which I think is a big upside to the card. And always having a blue card in your starting hand is pretty cool. It's come up multiple times where I just don't have a blue card. You get to pay 3 mana, draw your Yorion. It's been relevant in a lot more games than you think. And of course, our engine is a lot lower risk, and by that I mean it doesn't involve paying 8 life and then resolving an Uro. I think when I played Snow, one of the things I struggled with was paying like 8 life to find the Uro, and then when I play it gets Surgical, and that's really bad. And of course in some matchups, I think against specifically Storm, you can't actually pay that much life, because otherwise they just have like their 5 card like mini tendrils, and it gets you, and it feels so bad when that happens. And of course, if you enjoy like playing from behind, if you're a Miracles player at heart, I think this deck is actually quite a good deck to play. I think 90% of the game you're very far behind and you pull a hit really fast. So in that sense, if you like that kind of gameplay, this deck is the deck for you. Okay, well, so now we'll address the elephant in the room. So Yorion Post-Nerf. So I played Yorion from the time it was printed. I top rated the first challenge when companions were legal, playing a Miracles variant of Yorion, and I never actually stopped playing him even after they got nerfed. And we'll just talk about some of the, I guess, prerequisites for Yorion that I feel make him playable. I think it's not crazy to say that I'm probably one of the players on Modo, at least, that's played the most Yorion. Some of my friends joke about how I love him. But yeah, I think Yorion decks that are playable need to satisfy all these 4 conditions. So stuff like Yorion can't be the focus, right? Like Yorion used to be a lot more castable, I think, especially against decks like Eldrazi, where if I was playing Snow Miracles and I had nothing in my hand and my opponent played a Thought-Knot, they can't get Yorion. And when I get to 5 mana, I just play a 5 mana 4/5 flyer, and that blocks Thought-Knots here, and that was really powerful. So in that sense, I could play like really bad cards in my main deck to synergize with him, because casting a 5-drop on turn 5 wasn't actually that difficult. But obviously now that's not the case anymore. You have to put it in your hand. It's an 8 mana play. It's kind of crazy. I know there's a lot of debate on whether Yorion is playable in Legacy, and I think he could be, but he really can't be the main focus of your deck. And on to our second point. Cards 61 to 80 aren't fillers. So this one is kind of self-explanatory. Like one of the main arguments people make for not playing Yorion is, well, for 20 years of playing Magic, people have been arguing like, well, you shouldn't be playing the 61st card because that means there's one card that you could have cut from your deck that would have made it more consistent. And now instead of playing one more card, we're playing 20 more cards. But my argument is that at this point in the game, there are cards that are powerful enough that you can kind of justify that jump. So I think for especially our deck, there are some cards that were just not possible. Like they couldn't fit into the 60 card deck. Stuff like the third Punishing Fire, which is relevant because most people play 2 Force Negations. Stuff like Arkham's Astrolabe, Ice Fang Kodal. There are just so many cards that, could be the 61st card. And I think, maybe 5 years ago, when you were talking about Legacy, yes, there were maybe 3 candidates for the 61st card, and they were just all one-ofs. Now that's not the case anymore. There are like 20 cards, or maybe 20 is like an exaggeration. There's at least 10 cards, I think, that could be the 61st card. And when you have that kind of power level in, the next competing cards, I think it's actually not too bad because your deck doesn't actually get diluted that much. In fact, it gives you more coverage, I want to say. Like, it makes your deck more diverse. And this is both good and bad because, you're going to get more variance, right? Sometimes in the matchups where you need that Fatal Push or that Swords to Plowshares on turn 1, you're not going to see it. You're going to get hit by a Goblin Lackey and be like, oh no, I'm playing an 80 card deck. I can't do anything about this. And that's kind of where it is. But if you're playing against Eldrazi and you're playing 0 Ice Fangs, you're going to not feel so good when they play that, turn 2 Thought Knot, turn 3 Smasher, whereas Snoko kind of has advantages over there. So that was a problem I noticed when I played the 60 card version of Chase's deck, which I didn't do very well with. I just got like constantly destroyed by completely random things that Snoko wouldn't get destroyed by because I wasn't playing Astrolabe, because I wasn't playing Ice Fang. And I was like, wow, if I could put those cards into this deck, maybe it would work together. I don't really know. And that's kind of how we started talking about the Yorion version of Thieves. All right, so next, of course, mitigating variance. This one doesn't need explanation. I think Punishing Thieves is one of the control decks that sees just, straight up the most cards. Dak Faden is such a great card at digging to exactly what you need once you have enough mana. And yeah. Of course, finally, Sideboard Compression. So this one's kind of complicated. I think with the 80 card deck, you really need to be super duper disciplined with your sideboard building. It's actually not easy to fit enough sideboard cards that are relevant in basically all matchups. We'll obviously go through, how the sideboard was built, and I think you'll quickly see how much thought was basically put into building this deck because it really wasn't easy having enough cards for basically all matchups. All right, so now that we're done talking about all that garbage, so what do we actually gain, from 60 to 80? What are the next 20 cards? So, of course, like I mentioned, Ice Fang Kodal, Arkham's Astrolabe, these 2 cards I think are great reasons to, basically play the deck. I think originally when we first moved on to this version of the deck, we had like 5 or 6 Ice Fang Kodal effects. Obviously, combo became really popular because Snoko started destroying the format, so we've cut back a lot on the Ice Fang effects. But I do think that, you can always adjust to play more of them if you really wanted to. But I think these 2 are very good. And of course, finally, we get to play more basic lands. That's super huge. If you looked at the original versions of Chase's deck list, he played, 3 basics? 1 island, 1 swamp, and 1 forest, I think. And, having 3 basics is obviously cool. But there are games where you really want to have more mana in play. Sometimes your opponent assembles their Wasteland Lock on like turn 2 or turn 3, and like not being able to play out lands that just don't get destroyed immediately can sometimes be awkward. And I think playing more basics is obviously also just great against a number of decks, stuff like Moonstompy. Obviously, playing 80 cards, you see those basics less, but I think the overall ratio of basic lands in your deck definitely increased, right? Because we only went up 20 cards, but we're playing double the amount the amount of basics. So stuff we get to play, of course, infamous Crocus. If you guys played during Companion Legacy, you know how powerful cards like Crocus is. We also just get to play our own companion, so we can protect Yorion. I think it's been pretty common. I think it's come up a fair amount of times that the Crocus is really powerful. I think especially when your opponent plays a Chalice of the Void, and you need ways to kind of steer your deck. I think Crocus has actually been super powerful, between Uro and bouncing Yorion, and of course just helping you against decks like Dark Depths, right? Stryfo Pile is not normally a deck that can interact with the Mirror Lich token after it's been made, and I think being able to just have this one card in your main deck is super powerful. And of course we play some other crazy utility lands, stuff like Cephalid Coliseum, the sideboard. Sometimes we have Bajuka Box, sometimes we have Wasteland, sometimes you can even play Field of the Dead. I've tried that as well. I think it's really powerful. So next up we have Combo Hate and Increased Granularity. I think this is kind of the same point. I'll speak a little bit to both. So Combo Hate, of course, we were playing Leovold before. I think recently we've started playing Notion Thief main deck, just because of, I guess, the sheer number of Karn Echoes. I do think that having more control about which portion of your decks are dedicated to certain things is very powerful in a control deck. And what I mean by that is, if you play one card in your 60 cards to Combo Hate, the cost is very high because you have to cut a real card, right? The slots are already tight. We've already mentioned this. A lot of control decks are I really want to play the 61st card so I can play Cling to Dust or some kind of combo, or I wanted to play another win condition so I don't get surgical out of the game, stuff like that, right? And if you play 80 cards, you have greater control about dedicating parts of your deck for different matchups. So you can play 3 Ice Fangs, you can play 3 Punishing Fire, stuff like that, and not really feel too bad about the number of slots you dedicated for them, because your deck is just larger. And I know that's not a super big point, but I think it's something you'll notice that is a recurring theme in a lot of Yorion decks. You can sometimes squeeze sideboard cards into your main deck because you're not going to see those cards as often, and that's also part of the sideboard compression. And stuff like Leovold, he basically never makes the main deck, I think, or maybe in very combo heavy metas he's fine, but I think having access to unique effects like this, especially in a deck that sees a lot of cards, definitely does make a difference. And don't underestimate how often we'll see a singleton copy of a card, because Dak Faden just digs super deep, right? And if you get to reset the board against decks like Elves, for example, it's not unreasonable to say, well, I Toxic Deluge them, and then I activate Dak 2 or 3 times, I draw Leovold, and now all their engines are turned off, right? They can't go Elvish Visionary, the whole bounce thing with Wirewood Symbiote. They can't draw stuff like Glimpse of Nature and reload that way, and I think that's really powerful. All right, so enough talk about this. So obviously I can't talk about the benefits without talking about the weaknesses as well. So if you're playing 80 cards, you're gonna feel more force checks in the blind, right? If it's not an open decklist tournament, you're not gonna know when you have to mulligan to Forcible, and it can feel bad, I guess, losing to black stuff like Black Reanimator. Any kind of Grizzlebrand deck really is kind of not that cool. Sometimes you get cheesed and you basically didn't get to make any decisions because the density of Forcibles is a lot lower. And of course, one of the things I talk about a lot, I think, is about how all in our sweeper is. We can't actually play cards like Dead of Winter, I think, even though we are quote unquote a snow deck. We actually do have to kill Elks a fair amount of times because we don't actually play Oko, so there's no upside to playing Dead of Winter. So our sweeper is very all in, right? If we play against Delver, you pay 5 life into your Toxic Deluge, or 3 life or whatever, and if they Forcible it and it doesn't work, you basically lost the game, right? If you pay a bunch of life, it doesn't work, they still have their creatures, you're dead on the crackback. So that's kind of like a big downside too, I think, like not being able to play it in winter. Um, and I guess the third thing I want to talk about is kind of mana sequencing. So this is both, both these 2 points here, like mana sequencing. So one of the things with this deck is that a lot of decisions are made like once you keep your hand, because this is not as reliable of an Astrolabe deck when you compare it to Snoko. A lot of things matter a lot. Stuff like which land I played on turn 1, or why did I fetch this specific land on turn 2. And a lot of the matchups that you play, against Delver, for example, which, Chase considers a good matchup, is actually won on very, very thin margins often. If you survive, you'll have like 4 or 5, or maybe like it's less than 10 life. And if you made a small mistake at some point in the game, you get like super punished often. So yeah, that's definitely like a downside too, right? Like if the deck is harder to play against its good matchups, then I think that makes you think a lot more, and it also makes you feel a lot worse when you lose, because you can certainly play around things if you're adept at playing the deck. All right. Okay, so now this is like the boring math part. So if you're not interested in math, you can skip later into the video, but I'm going to talk about the number of lands here. So basically there are 3 numbers we kind of arrived at. So we started off with 28 lands, and I think we've played between 28 and 30 lands. I think when I initially played like the snow version of Yorion, I was only playing 27. But of course, back then we didn't have an 8 mana spell in our starting hand. It was only a 5 mana spell. And that version of Yorion also had a lot more, I guess, like fake cantrips. And what I mean by that is stuff like Abundant Growth. And I played like Omen of the Sea, which saw your deck a lot more. So 28, I think, is actually a reasonable number of lands to play. If you lower your curve enough, basically, if you look at the current stock lists, actually, let me just pull up the list that I played. So I played in a tournament pretty recently, the Octagon, and I made the finals. So this is the list that I'm currently playing with. And basically, with this list right now, with stuff like the main deck Notion Thief, and just based on like how I felt about the list, I don't think 28 lands is reasonable. I've really liked having more, but I do think that if you cut some of the higher CMC cards, it's possible that 28 is correct, especially if you go up to, just kind of back to the 6 or 5 Ice Fang Kodals, or like the, between this and Baleful Strix, obviously, and you cut some of the more clunky cards, I think. Definitely 28 is playable, but it's definitely greedy. 29 is also reasonable. Obviously, that's the number we're on. I think Chase actually did play 30 at some point. He played the card Seagate Restoration, which is both a spell and a land. And I think that specific card was very good in, I guess, a very Snoko heavy meta, or if you expect to play a lot of blue kind of fair control mirrors, I think it's good. But certainly, I think at this point in time, Delver's so popular, I don't really want to pay 3 life to play my really bad island on turn 1, and that's kind of why I think I recommend 29 lands to most people. But yeah, so if you ever have thoughts about these, if you're like if you're interested in how we got to these numbers, so basically Chase was very successful, I think, beginning of this year, or like, towards the end of last year. He won a lot of, he had like an insane number of trophies, like 25 or like 30 trophies or something. I don't remember, but he had a lot. And he was doing really well once he moved up from 21 to 22 lands. So basically, if we compared the 60 card 22 lands to the 80 cards, you'll find that if you want to get something that looks a lot more like the 60 card curve, which is, well, the bottom 3 graphs are the same. So these are the different ones, right? You'll find that if you want like kind of a nice mix between like 2 and 3 lands, the 30 land, I guess, version of the deck has the most similar looking graph with the most similar number of, I guess, quote unquote, keepable hands. Like, you'll just have to trust me and Chase that we did the hybrid geometric distribution correctly. But we put a lot of thought into this. So Basically, I think the most acceptable number with our current curve is between 29 and 30. The reason why you pick 29 over 30, I think, is that flooding is a real thing with this deck. And after a certain number of lands, you actually don't want to draw that many more. This deck actually wants more lands, I think, than your regular Snoko deck. So I know when I was playing Snoko, if I had 6 lands in play, I didn't want to play anymore. They were like, it was good enough. I could basically cast everything. I can cast Force Negation and play my 3-drop. It was kind of where I wanted to be. But you'll find that with this deck, you can have 10 lands in play and still possibly want to play like an 11th land. It wouldn't be crazy, just because of how big a mana sink a lot of the cards are. So stuff like Yorion is a huge mana sink. Uro, or like a bunch of cantrips into Uro, or casting 5 Punishing Fires in one turn. There's a lot of reason to want more mana. But we also have less ways to mitigate flooding. You're not going to see Brainstorm as often. So I think 29 is a nice kind of middle ground between like avoiding flooding in the late game versus kind of having enough lands to play the game when you keep your 7. So if you put it all together and you look at, so like I guess one big takeaway with this is if you look at the 60 card version. So the red line is the 60 card deck, right? And you're going from, this is the 19, if you're playing 19 lands in 60 cards, and this is if you're playing 23 lands in 60 cards. And if you look at the large variance between this, right? Like if you play 19 lands and 23, like the number of keepable hands you can keep changes by like 10%. That's a huge swing. So every land you include or exclude from your 60 card list actually does significantly change mulligan decisions, right? It's gonna affect your games. If you're talking about 10%, that's crazy, right? Like every match or every like 2 matches. Well, I guess not really 2 matches. I guess 3 matches. If you play like 3 games, it's gonna affect you're gonna have the mulligan once, and I think that's huge. But you'll notice if you're playing 80 cards, the difference is really not that big. It doesn't swing as much. And once again, this is 29, this is 30, this is 31, and this is 22. So I think it's clearly in the middle. It's between 29 and 30. I think this is where you want to be. Ignore the okay, I don't really know how else to explain this, but basically what I'm trying to say is there's a really strict rule, right? There's literally no optimal number. You can't play 29.5 lands. So you could play the 30th land that's also a spell, so you get Restoration, or you can just play 29 and kind of take the small variance difference. But I do think that like the difference between playing 29 and 30 is actually not that large. I think as long as you've seen the math and like have kind of accepted that like, okay, the best version of this deck played 22 lands, and that's close to where I want to be. As long as you make an informed decision, right? If you know that your meta game's all Delver, and you don't really want to play as many, you don't want to play Notion Thief, for example, or maybe you want to cut like a Drown in the Lock, or you don't want the 3rd Punishing Fire, and you want to play like another 1-drop, like a second Lightning Bolt, a 3rd Fatal Push, stuff like that. I think that's perfectly fine. As long as you're making it, as long as you're making an informed decision to do that, I think there's no strict rule. Like there's no such thing as like the correct number of lands. All right, so now moving on. Okay, this video's kind of long, but I guess we're gonna talk about what we play in our main deck and what are the core cards of the deck. So, getting started. First off, obviously we're gonna talk about the glue that holds the deck together. For Ponders, for Brainstorms, for Arcan's Astrolabe, this is like the easiest part of the deck. You always play all these cards. They're very powerful. They, introduce Xerox elements to the deck, and they help you find what you need. So I think one of the cards that is kind of discussed a lot, like obviously now it's not as crazy anymore. I remember when Stryfo started playing this card, I looked at this card and I was like, this card is terrible. It's like a 1 mana do nothing. And I didn't notice how powerful its escape was in this deck. And I think once you start picking up the deck and you played a couple games, you'll notice that like 4 mana draw 1 is insane, because oftentimes you'll have to kind of sacrifice cards in your hand to get tempo back with this deck once again, it plays from behind a lot. And Cling to Dust is just a way to convert those cards that you sacrificed into new cards, right? Like in the late game, when you're both top decking and you have a Cling to Dust, you feel so advantaged in the mirror. And honestly, it's just another card that's a way to give you velocity in the beginning of the game. You could play 2 or you could play 3. I think the number's not super set. I think with the more recent, I guess, changes to Legacy and more people playing Urza Stompy, Cling has kind of been a little bit awkward. But I think I'm generally pretty happy with Cling. I think 3 is where I want to be, but I understand going to 2 if you play a lot of D&T in your metagame. Maybe everyone has like a bunch of rest in pieces, or like you just really don't like the card. If you really wanted to cut it, I think I would only cut it for a 1 mana cantrip, and the only card that I can see fitting that is Preordain. But I do think Cling is better. It's also super powerful against graveyard decks with stuff like Hogak. It gives you some chance to win game 1, and I think that's huge because most snow decks typically auto lose game 1. It's like a really bad matchup, I think. And they kind of have to win game 2 and game 3. But having a card like this to exile the Hogak and make your opponent have a bunch of crappy 2/1s can really steal games for you. And of course, yeah, like I said, late game, it's insane. If you're top decking, you have this card in your graveyard, your opponent doesn't, they're gonna lose. All right, moving on. So now we're, I guess, kind of in the removal suite. Usually, I think we play a good mix of 1 mana removal spells. I know Chase has always played 1 push, 1 bolt. And I personally am a big fan of the main deck Pyroblast, even when I was playing Snow, or I guess Miracles, because Pyroblast is just like the best way to answer an Oko. Like, if you're playing the Oko subgame and you have no way to kill Oko when he has like 10 loyalty without actually punching him, I think that's just a recipe for a disaster in Legacy right now. So I think based on your metagame, you can kind of pick and choose. You could play 3 bullets or 3 pushes, but I think I wouldn't recommend it because having some diversity is generally good. I think the lowest number you want is 1 bolt, 1 push. And I think you could go up more, like more pushes, more Pyroblast, or I guess I wouldn't play the second copy of Pyroblast main deck, but you could play the Pyroblast. You could also play more pushes with the Pyroblast and the Lightning Bolt, which is kind of what I'm trying right now because I feel like Delver, is super popular, and I think decks like D&T and Elves in particular are decks that really want you to interact, especially when you're on the draw. If you don't have that Lightning Bolt on turn 1 to kill their Dryad Arbor, they're going to make a lot of mana. And if they play Allosaurus Shepherd, your Force Bolt isn't going to be good. So in that sense, I would consider it like a tempo card in those matchups, and is important. All right, next, Punishing Fire. Well, I don't have to explain this. You discard this card with your Dak Vein, and you buy it back with Grow the Burn Willows. It also kills Delver Secrets and a bunch of 1 mana 1/1s, or 2 mana 1/1s, or any matter of random creatures that are legacy playable are generally killed by Punishing Fire. The reason why this card isn't as good as it was, maybe like 3-4 years ago, is because of Dreadhorde Arcanist. This card is terrible against Dreadhorde Arcanist. But I think if you think of this card as an engine piece, and by that I mean if you compare it to a card like Sylvan Library. Like, Sylvan Library doesn't actually do anything. It draws cards for you. You can, it allows you to pay 16 life to draw 4 cards. And this card, I think, if it had no text on it, might be, okay in our deck. Because it's just part of our engine. The fact that it can also just shock things for 2 mana is a huge upside, I think. And even though on the surface, this card can seem really weak, doesn't really do anything in the early game, I think it's still playable. There's a lot of reasons why this card I think is good in this deck, and I'm pretty sure once you start playing the deck, you'll find out why. In the late game, it's a huge mana sink. It's pretty good against Oko, I think, in the late game because obviously being able to do like 8-10 damage in 1 turn, or on your opponent's end step is just like insane. But I think it definitely has some weaknesses in the early game that you really have to fill out with your 1 mana and 2 mana removals. Next, Drown the Lock. This card I think is one of the reasons to play Stryfo Pile. I think it's one of the best I guess counter spells I think that's been printed in recent history. It acts as both removal and counterspell. Like I think this card is so good that like it's just so much better than cards like counterspell, for example, right? Because if you play against Death and Taxes, like this card is hard to turn on, but it does work once you are able to kill off like the initial number of creatures. And I think having a card that's good in both fair and combo matchups is something that's very unique to our deck because Snowco just doesn't have cards like that. Like Force Negation is good against combo, but it's not usually good against fair. Same thing can be said for Boards of Wool. Typically, Abrupt Decay is only good against fair decks, but it's really bad against like Show and Tell. It doesn't do anything against Reanimator. But this card, it does it all. It's very good. And of course, Assassin's Trophy. That's kind of one of the hallmarks of this deck. I know this card could be difficult. I guess when I first started making this video, or like when I first started thinking about this primer, people were a lot more. I guess people were a lot lower on Assassin's Trophy. Like there were no snow decks that played it basically, and nowadays you'll see people play main deck Assassin's Trophy because that's how good the card is. I think if you're playing a deck that wants to go late and wants to see the late game, it's important to be able to interact with basically everything, right? I think people have noticed this. Like, you need to be able to kill Caracases so that you can push your Uro through. And that's why I think this is one of the best Uro decks, because you basically never get stonewalled by a Caracas. You're always drawing to one of your 4 Assassin's Trophies. You can always interact with basically anything that's stopping you from winning. And I think this card is just, like, so good in this deck, because giving your opponent a basic typically doesn't matter, and we're usually the most powerful deck in the late game. Well, obviously, aside from some very special decks. I think Assassin's Trophy is at its worst against Death and Taxes, because they play a bunch of ports, and if we give them a basic, it gives them mana to turn off our mana, which I think does hurt us. But I think outside of that, against any Stompy deck, Assassin's Trophy is just crazy. It's so good against a Resolved Karn. It's one of the problems that I had a lot playing Miracles, just killing Resolved Planeswalkers, and this card just solves it all. Alright, so now we have kind of like our payoffs, and like, I guess, creatures. So Dak Faden, they are part of the Dex engine. I think it can be misleading at first when you look at the deck and you find that, like, oh, it's just Dak Faden and Punishing Fire. You'll find that, Dak Faden and Uro are also is also a really powerful part of the engine. Being able to discard Uro and basically play 4 mana 6/6 that ETBs draws a card and gains 3 life is just absolutely insane. There's so many matchups where this matters a ton. A lot of people also just disrespect Dak Faden. I play against multiple Hogak opponents where I play Dak, I discard like a random card. I don't discard Uro, and like they just ignore Dak. They go for face. Next turn I play an Uro, I still have Dak, and I'm starting to ultimate. His ultimate is, like, obviously it wins the game against so many decks. And he actually ultimates pretty quickly, right? He ultimates in 4 turns, and he automatically puts himself out of Lightning Bolt range, which I think is like a huge advantage over something like Jace the White Sculptor. Chase loves Dak Faden, Stryfo, and for good reason. I think he's a really powerful card in this deck. Uro, nothing needs to be said. There's so many people who think this card needs to be banned in Legacy. It's really powerful, especially for our deck. I think Uro is one of those cards that plays well from both ahead and behind. He's in that way, I guess in that sense, he's pretty similar to Oko. He's kind of good all the time. He does exactly what we want to do. We use our life total as a resource against stuff like Delver. We take a bunch of hits because we're trying to set up our mana and play our expensive spells. And Uro kind of does it all, right? He buys time for us. He stabilizes the board. He is a big threat. He ends the game when he attacks. Stuff like that. All right, next, Snapcaster Mage. So I guess we started off playing this deck with a lot less Snapcasters. But I think one of the things that Chase really liked with the 60-card version was that he could pretty consistently cast 5 or 6 Assassin's Trophies against decks that you wanted to do that against. So stuff like maybe Mono Green Post. you could really take them off a bunch of lands. Or I guess not Mono Green Post. Mono Green Post is a bad example. Like Colorless Post, sorry. Yeah. So against Colorless Post, I think if you can trophy your opponent like 5 times, they basically have no mana, and that's really important, I think, in some matchups. And the more trophies you cast each game, the better the next one is, right? Like the first trophy is always the worst because they're most likely to have a basic in their deck. But when you're like on turn 10 and your opponent has like 5 basics in play, they're not going to be able to find another copy of a basic land if they already fetched all of them. And that's why I guess having more snaps is pretty powerful. Of course, post board, Snapcaster is insane with cards like with Pyroblast, and just generally, I think he improves a lot in the post board game. So I think Snapcaster is a fairly playable card. I think depending on what you have in your metagame, playing more Ice Fangs or playing more Snapcasters is pretty reasonable. That's why these numbers are so variant. Like we've played builds with only 1 Snapcaster, and we've played builds with 5 Ice Fang Codals, and by that I mean 4 Codals and 1 Baleful Strix. I think at its core, what we need is just enough blue cards to support Force of Will, and any mix of these cards is acceptable, I think, depending on what you think you're going to play against, I think. And that's kind of the theme of this deck, right? Like, if you look at our main deck recommendations, it talks a lot, or I guess it kind of references, like, you kind of need to know what you are going to play against, because that's like, I guess like a recurring theme with control decks. What you want to play against and what you think you're going to play against is what you kind of put in your deck to beat. All right, yeah, cool. And of course, like, this doesn't need to be said, but Snapcaster and Yorion are like great together. Same with Ice Fang Codal. I think Ice Fang is typically a pretty mopey card in the Snow Mirrors because it's just a 1-mana 1/1. Your opponent's playing like Uros and like gaining like infinite life because you have to sort each other's Uros, and like oftentimes you're in like the super late game. You have like 10 cards in your library and you're at like 50 life. A 2-mana 1/1, it's never gonna get there. But I think the fact that Ice Fang is just such a threat with the Sky Noodle is a big I guess reason to play more copies. So if you like, or I guess if you think you're gonna play a lot of fair matchups, I think playing more Ice Fang is not like necessarily crazy either. It's just really bad against combo normally. All right, so now I guess we talk about the counter suite. So the forces. I actually think. Actually, no. Let's talk about the sweepers and combo hit first. So of course sweepers here. I think we start off with only 1 Deluge and no engineers in the main deck, but I think as Elves has become more popular and like a bunch of more creature decks, with the printing of Skyclave Apparition, defending the board has become more important, especially with ways that I guess remove Uro without gaining us life. So stuff like Skyclave on Uro is actually pretty. Not only is it incredibly tempo positive for the D&T player, we also just don't get the life buffer anymore. So I think having more copies of sweepers in your main deck is pretty important. Right now I'm playing two copies of Deluge, but I can also see the third sweeper like a one-off engineer, I think, in the main deck. It's probably playable depending on what you want. Combo hate here, I think, is also pretty dependent on what you want to play. I think between outside of these two, you can also play the Thief main deck, Notion Thief. It all depends on what you think you're going to play against. I do think that if you are in a very open metagame, the best card to play is Leovold, because he's good with the Caracas in the main deck. He is a blue card that you can pitch. He's cheaper than 4 mana, which is relevant. I think the one, being able to come down a turn earlier can matter a lot in a lot of spots. And I think the card that I would avoid playing is Opposition Agent, because he's the most, I guess, conditional. His floor is very low. It's, a 3 mana 3/2 flash at worst. And that's pretty bad. I don't think I ever want to play a card like that. But I think in some metagames, if you know your opponent's going to be searching their deck a lot, or if for some reason Mono Green Cloud Post or TES is like the best deck in the format, I can definitely see playing one Opposition Agent main deck over like the Leovold. Okay, so now we'll talk about like Force of Will and Force Negation. So, um, I think a lot of people question, especially recently, why there are not more Force Negations in our deck. Especially with certain high-profile players, like Pemin, Mark. He's a good friend of mine. Are both like lovers of miracles. I play miracles a lot myself for many years. Basically, only play miracles before I started playing Snoko and this deck, of course. But I do think that after playing this deck, I think Force of Will is just such a more powerful card that compared to Force Negation. And what I mean by that is this deck needs to buy tempo. And the way you buy tempo is by, I guess, trading down on cards, because you have many ways to recoup that card disadvantage. And I think Force of Negation being conditional makes it significantly worse than Force of Will. There are many games where I've played, if you watched like the Lotus Box stream, the Octagon games, I Force of Will Delver. I mean, I don't want to say all the time, but it's a play that you have to make pretty often. And Force Negation, just not being able to stop a creature is huge. In fair matchups, I basically never want to draw Force Negation because I think it's terrible. And the whole reason for playing Forces at all, or like Force Negation at all, is that you have to increase your force density to I guess keep up with the combo decks, right? You are gonna already fail force checks more, but you can't fail them all the time, and that's kind of why we have Force Negation. So that's kind of my reasoning for not wanting to play 8 forces. I just think Force 5 and 6 are so much worse than the first 4. Like, if I could play 6 Force of Wills, I'm willing to maybe even consider playing, one more copy, like 7 Force of Wills. But I think just because we can't play more Forcefuls and we have to play Force Negation, I'm just not super happy. Force Negation is just so much worse in our deck. Sometimes we want to play like an on-curve Dak Faden. We can't protect it. I think us enabling ourselves to play Magic is more important than stopping our opponent, basically. And the only matchups where you want to stop your opponent from doing whatever they're doing is exactly when they kill you with like an Ad Nauseam or a Grizzlebrand or like a Reanimate or an Entomb or something like that. So hopefully that kind of explains why we don't have 8 forces in our deck. Yeah. All right, so moving on now. Sideboarding. So here we're gonna, I guess, address one of the biggest problems with Yorion. So we are playing an 80 card deck, and our sideboard, it's not even 15 cards, it's 14 cards, because we have to put our companion in the sideboard. And that's huge, right? If you compared that to a 60 card deck, you have a much larger sideboard in a 60 card deck. And considering you play at least 50% of your games in post-board matches, that changes how you have to build your sideboard. It straight up just is a huge downside, I think, to playing 80 cards. So I think one of the things is having good discipline in what you put in your sideboard, right? Like, oftentimes you'll find that Snoko, for example, they'll play like grind cards in their sideboard, or like miracles. Sometimes you could have like the one-off like Gideon Ally Zendikar that's like your pet card. I think you have to avoid that at all costs when you're playing Yorion. Well, except for Notion Thief, obviously, because he gets a free pass. But yeah, you have to avoid cards that are medium, I think. You have to really target exactly what you want to play against and put those cards in your sideboard to beat those matchups. But I also do think that the sideboard is very flexible, right? Like, I guess we've had some really, really creative solutions to compressing the sideboard, which we'll definitely talk about right now. So getting it right into it. Okay, so personally, I think there are 4 main pillars of the sideboard. The most obvious one, obviously, is Pyroblast. So we just always have 3 copies of Pyroblast, I think, in the 95. So if you have 1 in your main deck, I think it's reasonable to only have 2. But you always have this card in your sideboard. It's one of the reasons to be splashing red. which this deck technically is, splashing red. And then usually we have like 2 or 3 cards for Graveyard Hate, sometimes more if you really don't like playing against graveyard decks, or if your metagame is particularly heavy in like Hogak or stuff like that. And then usually we have like 2 or 3 cards in the combo, so in the combo hate kind of pillar. So this could include, you know, cards like Fuzzlestorm, although not played very often anymore. Collector Oof is a card that we used to play. Stuff like Mindbreak Trap also definitely playable. I think as long as you have a like reasonable split between like hate permanents and counter spells, or, you know, for example, if you know that Mindbreak Trap is very good because TES is really popular in your metagame, then that's kind of where you want to lean towards. And okay, so the last kind of miscellaneous category is kind of a part reserved for fixing what the deck is weak against. And what I mean by that is stuff like being able to mitigate Wasteland, or like helping with mana problems, or as I discussed earlier, Sideboard Compression. So what does that mean? What cards are we talking about here? We'll get into that a little bit later. So these are just some of the possibilities, I think. I'm just gonna talk about what I think shouldn't be played, or like cards I've tried maybe, just to kind of quickly go over this. So Scavenging Ooze is a card that I basically never cut. I think it's just insane. It's been like super good for me. It's good against all the graveyard decks. It's good against Delver as a possible 2-mana 4/4. It helps a lot against what Delver wants to do against us in like Clothy, stuff like that. So I wouldn't ever cut it. I would also always play the 1 copy of Surgical, I think. There are just so many decks that bring this card, especially as a one-off, is good against. Now, the next cards that we play are kind of part of the compression. So Crop Rotation Bajuka Bog is a package that I noticed Edgar used to play a lot. Edgar, I can't pronounce his last name, but he plays at a local game store that I also play at. And one of the things he used to play, I think, was you know, basically this Crop Rotation package in the sideboard, and I thought it was really cool. And if you really think about how it impacts our sideboard, it actually helps a lot. I'll talk about that, you know, once again later on. And a card that we've played a lot, of course, is Nile Spellbomb. Right now, we're not playing it, but it's a really good card. It's possibly even main deckable before the printing of Cling to Dust, but right now, obviously, Cling is just like a lot better. Cards that I really would avoid, obviously, Grafdigger's Cage is terrible with Uro. I've tried this Ashiok before, but I think it's a little too cute, I think, in our deck. It's just a little bit too slow against stuff like Hogak, and I think in general it comes down a little too late to matter. It doesn't actually do what you often want it to do, unless you're playing against Primeval Titan decks, and I think that's the main reason I considered it. But I think it's kind of a fake graveyard hate card, if that makes sense. All right, next, Convocate. I think Chase has played the Force Negation sideboard before. I don't like sideboard Force Negations. I think you really want slam dunk cards in your sideboard, but it is playable. Mindbreak Trap is a card that I've been advocating for a long time. I think a lot of combo decks, they could play around Mindbreak Trap, but I also think that they can't always do it. Mindbreak Trap is also just kind of, like, if you think about like the decks that force check you, right? Mindbreak Trap is just a forceable that doesn't need you to pitch another card, and I think being able to bring in effects like this is very valuable, especially if you think you're gonna get comboed very often. And of course, these are some of the other hate permanents we play. You know, Notion Thief, it's basically always in the deck. Sometimes it's main deck. Obstinate Agent, I already discussed. It's good against a slew. It's even good against some fair decks. I mean, I don't know if you consider Cloud Post a fair deck, but basically against most post decks, I think I like this card a lot. It's decent against some fair matchups, but like I said, its floor is pretty low, so I'll be careful. Obviously, it's good against Doomsday. In fact, it's one of the only good sideboard cards against Doomsday, and Doomsday is definitely one of the best combo decks in Legacy right now. So if you think you're going to play against Doomsday, Opposition Agent is a card that I would look to play. Collector Oof is a card that's great against TES. It's good against the Urza Stompy deck. There are lots of, I guess, metagames that I would consider playing this card in. Right now, I think Chase doesn't like it. I've been okay with playing it. I mean, I think I would play it in today's metagame because I think Urza Stompy is just so popular. Um, and that deck is not good against Collector Oof, especially because their like Plan B doesn't often get there against us. And yeah, Damping Sphere, Self Exponent Street is good against Storm. It's good against Clown Post. If you haven't noticed, most of our cyber cards for like combo is good against both. I guess good against multiple decks. I think, and I think that, like I said, that's very important, right? Like having cards that do more things than just one thing is important in our very tiny sideboard because you want to be able to have decent sideboard mapping against as many decks as possible. You don't really want to have any matchups where you look at your sideboard and go like, wow, I can't really bring anything in because this is just terrible. Because that would be, well, terrible. Yeah, and against blue decks, Power Blast, I already mentioned, Leovold Thief. You could play a second Leovold in your sideboard. I've done that before. I don't do it anymore because I think Leovold is a lot worse recently. But you can definitely play more of him if you like. Second Thief, also very playable. Feel the Dead is a card that I also tried. I think it's fine. I mean, I don't think it didn't do what I wanted it to do, I think, when I first put it into the deck, which is inevitability, but it's definitely a card that you can consider if you like, I guess, playing more lands. All right, so what about in Miscellany? So I would consider this 3 different things that we play. So the first off is mana mitigation. If you haven't noticed, this deck plays a lot of non-basics, and of course that means your opponent is going to try to wasteland you off of mana. And if you have no mana, you can't play the game. That's terrible. So I think cards that we've played, I think Carpet of Flowers is a card that has, obviously recently been, or I guess like for maybe the past 5 months has been super popular, and for good reason. I think this card is just so good. The only deck that ever played this card, I think, in the past was what's that Food Chain deck? Oh my god, I can't remember now. Food Chain. Oh, I think it is just called Food Chain. Never mind. Yeah. So yeah, the Miss Hologriffin deck was the only deck that I think played this card, and it was like not popular at all. Maybe Enchantress played it, I think, but nowadays I think there's so many more people who've kind of realized how good this card is. I guess the reason why we had 2 copies in the early days was because Delver was playing multiple copies of Winter Orb, and that card is really bad for us. I think more recently we've noticed that there are a lot more non-blue decks, so stuff like Death and Taxes and just decks that want to wasteland you off of, stuff like Green White Reclaimer. I think lands also had like a reasonable amount of resurgence recently with the printing of Valakut Exploration. So I think having Life in the Loam is actually also pretty cool. Like I've been playing a lot with this card, and I discussed it with Chase, and I think he's playing it now too, which is really cool. It's kind of like a Carpet of Flowers that you can bring in against non-blue decks because you don't even have to loam the Life in the Loam for it to be good, right? Like 2 mana, draw 2 lands is exactly where we want to be in a lot of these mana denial / kind of like Rishadan Port, Wasteland decks. Yeah, it's pretty good. And of course, next, Sweeper's Removal. So this is where I think me and Chase's list differ a little bit. Chase really likes Pernicious Deed. It's a card that I'm a lot lower on. I think it's a little clunky, but I perfectly understand it. I think it's really good when your opponent plays multiple block pieces. You're able to kind of clear the way. It also kind of stops your opponent from like doing anything, right? Like if you think about like decks like D&T, where they kind of want to deploy threat after threat and deny your mana, if you play the Pernicious Deed, they're not going to play anything else anymore. And I think that's really good for you because if their clock is slow, you can really pick and choose when you want to blow it up. And obviously once it's resolved, you can it's really mana efficient in that sense, right? You can have like an instant speed sweeper. It's really good against stuff like Chalice of the Void or multiple Chalice of the Voids, Trinisphere. There's so many things that this card is good against, but I think this card, the Sideboard Abrupt Decay, I think that used to be played, is a reason to play it, mostly because of Chalice on 2, which, by the way, destroys our deck. And, yeah. So, other cards you can play in this, I guess, category, obviously Toxic Delusion, Plague Engineer, we already discussed this. If you want more copies of them, they belong in your sideboard. I think you don't want to play more than 2 or 3 in your main deck, because they're pretty dead when you draw them. And, of course, finally, we have the compression cards. And by this word, I mean literally crop rotation. So let's talk a little bit more about crop rotation. So crop rotation is a very unique card because it's a single card that isn't actually a good sideboard card, right? Like if you look at crop rotation, we can't really crop rotate for anything. The only thing we can get is like Caracas, but that's where it kind of gets complicated because the fact that you can play one crop rotation and we already have the Caracas main deck, which makes the crop rotation already like a reasonable card. But if you play like, for example, one copy of Bajuka Bach in your sideboard, and you play the crop rotation, you basically filled 2 cards of Graveyard Hate, but with a crop rotation in your sideboard. I don't know if that makes sense. So it's kind of like a Joker card. It can be anything, right? And it can get whichever land is relevant in the matchup that you boarded it in, if that makes sense. So I think that's pretty huge. I think this was kind of the best way I could think of to really have a card that's good against both fair and unfair. So like, I played Field of the Dead before, so I had Field of the Dead and Bajuka Bog, and I had the Caracas main deck, and I found it to be really good. I mean, I really love this package. Obviously, it's a card that Edgar was playing from like long ago. It's just something that I remember he used to do, and I really wanted to try it, and it's worked out like great, I think, for this deck in particular. So yeah, like if you look at all this, like Cephalic Coliseum is a recent innovation that Chase thought of. I remember when I asked him, I was like, oh, do you think we can play so I used to play like a prison deck in Modern. Ibnu Rivulet was my win condition, and I think there was a random day where we were playing like a challenge or like some kind of tournament, and I was like, do you think we can play Ibnu Rivulet? And he was like, no, you just play Cephalic Coliseum. And this card has been basically insane in like every matchup. I think this card is so good. In the late game, it's a land that lets us draw 3 cards and like discard all of the land flood that we have. Against Doomsday, it basically makes it so that they can't win. And with Notion Thief in play, it's basically an Ancestral, which is like just like so good. But yeah, like I would have tangent that for a bit. But yeah, like basically what I'm saying is having like a Joker card, I think, is really important in your sideboard because it basically creates another sideboard slot for whatever card you want the crop rotation to be. And I think this is a really cool innovation. Okay, cool. All right, so now we're gonna go on to where there are a bunch of weird questions. These are gonna be very random, and I'm just gonna kind of go off and answer as many of them as I can to the best of my ability without going off tangent, but this part could be really boring. But yeah, do you have a sideboard guide? No, we don't. But I do think that we answer a fair number of sideboarding questions in the Grixis Discord. I'll have a link for that at the end of this video. It's kind of where a lot of the discussion, I think, happens regarding the deck. It's basically where I started developing Snow, and it's how I met Chase. And we talk about a lot. I think we help most people, regardless of what kind of deck they're playing. But we don't have a sideboard guide. And the main reason for that is I think sideboard guides, and I think Chase agrees with this, are not super useful if you don't understand why certain cards are in the sideboard. And I think understanding how you play each matchup is the most important thing that you need to do as a control player, or like specifically this deck, I guess. So sideboarding is like very different, and I think any good player will say the same thing. And I know that sucks because that means there's no easy way to kind of look at how we approach different matchups. But I also think that it's a lot of work for basically a very short-lived. Like, if we change like 5 cards in our sideboard, then suddenly the old sideboard guide we have is completely worthless. It doesn't do anything anymore. So yeah, like I encourage you guys to hopefully, watch this primer, which I assume you have if you've made it here, and kind of understand why we have certain cards in the sideboard. And I hope that will help you sideboard better. But if you have questions, feel free to ask us in the Discord. We're like super friendly. How about X card? Is it playable main deck sideboard? Okay, so this is like asked super often. I think like some people will be like, "What about Hull Breacher? Can I play Hull Breacher if I want to play Hull Breacher?" Well, yes, you can. I think that the short answer to this deck is it's already kind of like the core. I think is very solid, but there are flex slots, right? Like it's not like we're playing 80 cards that are like uber powerful and you can't cut anything. I think the short answer is you can play anything you want, really. As long as you have a good justification for why you put the card in the deck and what it's doing in the deck. Um, I think it's completely fair. I mean, Chase has played Shark Typhoon. I've tried playing stuff like Stifle. I think I've seen just about everything. I mean, I've played like a Garrick sideboard before. I think this deck can even play like Chandra Awakened Inferno if you really wanted to. Um, Everything is justifiable. Well, okay, no, sorry. Any card is playable as long as you can justify why you put it in the deck. And if it's to fix a certain bad matchup that you know you're going to play against, then yes, it is playable. This deck can basically play anything because it has such a good mana base, right? Like, it's not a deck that's reliant on Astrolabe to cast its spells. Obviously, Astrolabe is a nice addition, but, you know, I think, yeah, anything is playable. All right, moving on. I have difficulty with X matchup. How do I approach it? So this one is hard. Like I said, I remember when I picked this deck up, hands down, fastest 0-3 I've ever had. There are a lot of games where there are a lot of decisions made just kind of quickly. And if you're new to the deck, you might not put much thought into it. And it's really easy to kind of miss why you lost. And I think, Stryfo has obviously helped me a lot because I was a big dummy when I started playing the deck. But I think when talking to him, he really explained, what he tries to do in each matchup. And I think that's important. But outside of getting advice in the Discord, once again, we'll be at the end. I think the most important thing is to just grind a ton of games. I think the more you lose with this deck, the more you are able to understand what you're supposed to do and be aware of like what your game plan is, I guess, against most decks. Like, I'm not the best. I mean, I'm not even close to being good with this deck, and I feel like I have a billion things to learn. But yeah, I think the payoff is very large, so keep at it. Don't give up. All right, next. How does this deck beat Wasteland? Well, like I said, I think a lot of micro decisions matter a lot. I'll talk a little bit about that in towards the end of the video, where I kind of give you some tips that have helped me play the deck. But short answer is you don't lose to Wasteland. In fact, this deck is actually pretty good against decks that only want to Wasteland you. So stuff like lands, I think, is actually a good matchup. As long as you mana sequence correctly, which is something that's kind of been thrown to the wayside because of Arkham's Astrolabe and how prevalent that card is. But if you like playing a deck that cares about what order you play your lands in, which land you played first, and like what spells you cast, because your mana might be vulnerable, then this is a good deck to start. Okoware. So this question gets asked a lot, and there are a lot of people who we play against who play Pithing Needle on turn 1 and they name Oko Thief of Crowns. So why don't we play Oko? I think short answer to that is I think Oko doesn't actually have a justifiable reason to be in the deck. We're behind a lot on board, I think, most of the games. And if your opponent already has like 5 power of creatures on turn 3, do you really want to cast an Oko and make a food, and then he just gets like punched into like submission and dies? I think we have Astrolabe like just not as often as Snoko. For obvious reasons, we're playing 80 cards. We only have 4 Astrolabes. He just doesn't do a ton. And I think, like I said, one of the big reasons to play Snow is that they win really fast when they're uncontested, right? So Oko is the perfect card for being good defensively and also being good offensively. Like, you can play him on turn 3, he makes a dude, and like he kills your opponent really quickly if they can't answer him. But I think that's not really where you want to be with with Thieves. You know, a lot of times you really, really want the game to go long. All you want to do is like play your lands, like remove what's on the board that's threatening to kill you, and like set up a game where you have 10 mana in play, you have an Uro like in your graveyard, and like a Dak Fame going to kind of dig you through your deck. So Oko just doesn't really help with either game plan, right? Like it doesn't swing the board by sweeping it, but I mean, and you know, he can obviously kill your opponent fast, but that's not really something that I'm particularly interested in. So I think that's why we're not playing Oko. At least that's my understanding for why I'm not playing Oko. But if you really, really, really wanted to play him, you could probably make space for him. But I just don't think he belongs in this deck because we are already good against like Chalice of the Void decks, right? Like I remember when I started playing Oko in Miracles, the whole reason why I started playing him was because he was so good against stuff like Mono Red Stompy. You know, like I remember playing Eternal Weekend 2019. When Ren was legal, he was amazing against Ren and Six, but he was also just insane against Mono Red Stompy. Like I would make one Elk on turn 3, and like all their goblins are just like useless because they're 2/2s, right? Like none of them do anything against 1/3/3. But one of the strengths of this deck is that it's already really good against a lot of Chalice decks. You don't really need Oko to attack Planeswalkers because you can kill them with Assassin's Trophy. So, I think it's a good reason to not play Oko, just based on those two things. Veil of Summerwear. Well, if you haven't noticed, our spells are really clunky. I've already went over this, but we're the opposite of Snoko, right? We're not hyper efficient. We play cards that do a lot of things, but are not good at doing one specific thing. So I think Veil of Summer is kind of the definition of doing one specific thing really well for really cheap. So it's very conditional. I think oftentimes our spells are already very clunky. So if you're casting something like John the Lock and you want to Veil, that usually doesn't play around Daze. So Veil doesn't actually do what you want it to do, right? If you play against Delver, they Pyroblast your John the Lock and you're like Veil of Summer, and they just Daze your Drown, and it's like, well, I mean, I still lost the counter war. And I think it doesn't do what you want it to do because we also get wastelanded a fair amount of times, especially against decks like Delver. So I think overall, and I think, you know, obviously Veil of Summer started off as one of the best cards against combo. I remember when I was playing it, I would just like constantly destroy combo players because none of them like ever played around it, and like everyone was playing Thoughtseize back then. But nowadays, nobody plays Duress, nobody plays Thoughtseize. Okay, well, not nobody. There are decks that still play it, but I just feel like overall people play around this card like way better nowadays. And against Delver, we rarely get to cash out on it. So I think it just doesn't have a place in our sideboard or main deck. All right, finally, viability and skill requirements. So I think this is also pretty, like, I guess I don't know if people ask it pretty often, but I certainly think about it, right? Like when you look at this deck and you look at like the people who play it, it's literally just, well, Stryfo like winning like crazy, and not many other people playing the deck. So how viable is this deck? And I think the answer is the deck is actually quite strong. I definitely don't think that this deck is bad. But I think that the hurdles that you have to kind of jump over to pick it up is a lot. So if you're a person who doesn't play a lot of Legacy, it's very easy to build a deck, play like 5 matches, and like lose all of them and be like, wow, this deck is terrible. I must just be like bad compared to Chase Hansen. Well, yes and no. I think the deck is as good as its pilot, basically. The deck is very powerful, but you really have to put a lot of thought into what you're doing, especially in the early turns of the game. In the late game, it doesn't really matter as much because you have all your mana under you and like you can do a lot of stuff. But like particularly in the early game, I think there's a lot to learn from what Chase does. And you know, he doesn't talk about it. Obviously, you know, he streams a lot. If you guys didn't know, he streams every Sunday. He plays a challenge. He's been doing it for like 2 years, I think. I don't know, maybe more than that. Who knows? But I think the skill requirement is not as high as you think, but what you need to do on turn 1 and 2 is by far the most important and like key things to like doing well with this deck. So the deck is 100% viable. It's definitely tier 1 power level in my opinion, but just because of how hard it is to pick up and like how bad it feels to get like wastelanded or like punished for like a very small misplay, some people avoid it. So yeah. Okay, so now gameplay tips. So this is just like stuff that I've learned sometimes the hard way while playing the deck. So if you're considering picking up the deck, like here are just some things that I'll talk about. All right, so first off, the best fetch land in your deck is Polluted Delta. So I guess we'll talk about like, I guess I'll just have to, yeah. So the best fetch land in your deck is obviously Polluted Delta because it literally gets almost all your basics, and you can get every single color with this, right? Like, regardless of which land they've wastelanded, as long as you have a red source, or as long as you have a green source, or as long as you have a black source left in your deck, this land will always get it. So you should always play this land later if possible. Or if you know that you have to cast a spell on turn 2, then playing this land first is better, because depending on what other colored source you draw, this fetch land can get whatever you need outside of that other color that you top decked, if that makes sense. All right, next, understanding basics. So the basics in this deck are dual lands too, and you have to understand that. I know that it's really easy to fetch like 3 or 4 duals with this deck, and you just like don't fetch your basics. But Basic Island is basically, well, I guess Snow Covered Island is basically a dual in a sense that it casts Arkham's Astrolabe and blue spells. So they're just really, really bad duals. Yeah. All right. Next, fetch equals possibility. So this one goes back to kind of Polluted Delta being the best fetch, I guess. Like, it relates to that a little bit. So on turn 1, if your mana doesn't look good, and what I mean by that is if you have a Swamp and a Verdant Catacombs in your hand and you have a Ponder, it's not always correct to just Ponder on turn 1, because you have to understand that like fetching with that Verdant Catacomb is sacrificing the opportunity cost of like what that fetch land represents in terms of color, right? So if you get like a Tropical Island, then you have no access to red anymore. And like if you have a Lightning Bolt or like a Pyroblast in your hand that you know might be useful, then sometimes it's correct to just like not play the Ponder. Like, don't rush into cantripping just because you're greedy for mana efficiency, because in this deck, like, mana sequencing is super important. Like, respecting Wasteland is one of the things that you have to do. And if you know that you can't play Magic if you get wastelanded, then sometimes it's correct to just wait and see what you draw. All right, next. Don't expose red. This one's self-explanatory. There are only 2 red lands in the deck that are fetchable. Sometimes 3, if you're playing 2 Volks and the Badlands. But typically you don't really want to get red. If you haven't noticed, this deck is basically a bug deck that's splashing red for Dak Faden and Punishing Fire. And of course Pyroblast, but we won't talk about that card. You don't actually need to cast red spells that often. And I think that's kind of why we don't have that many red cards in our sideboard too. If you notice that, like, you look at like the older lists, more often than not, it's just a bunch of like black and green or like sometimes blue cards. Don't get red if you don't need it, basically. That's what I'm trying to say. It makes it worse if they get to wasteland us both. Like, I guess wasteland us off of red completely. But yeah. Okay. Next, Iceland Kotal. So one of the tricks that I've learned just playing Yorion for such a long time, or Yorion for such a long time, is that your Ice Fang is better than your opponent's, right? If you're threatening to eventually cast Yorion, the Ice Fang Kotal is very powerful. It represents another card, if it doesn't die. So one of the common things I do is no attacks, no blocks, because I don't want my opponent to trade my Ice Fang for theirs, so that when my Yorion is cast, it's better. And I think this is relevant in a lot of matchups. So I think against stuff like, um, what's that deck called? Blue Green Omnitel. That's a matchup where I don't think the one damage matters often enough because you basically have to stop your opponent from winning. Um, and I'm just not really interested in blocking their Ice Fang either because their one damage is basically never gonna get there. Cool. Um, yeah. So no attacks, no blocks because your Ice Fang is worth more than theirs. You don't want to trade. Next, clearing target yourself. I know that it's kind of counterintuitive, but I think cleaning your own cards is super relevant. Sometimes you need to drown certain things, and as you already know, drown is not without its downsides. It sometimes can be a little late in turning itself on, especially if your opponent's playing no fetch land. So against stuff like D&T, for example, if you've been wastelanded and they have one wasteland in their graveyard, you don't want to cling it because you want to be able to drown like a Mother of Runes, or any kind of one drop. So clean yourself, it's something that I do pretty often. Make sure you understand like when you do it and when you don't do it. I think against Delver, that's another time where sometimes I would just not cling them because outside of Jetro Arcanist, they don't really use their graveyard that much. Sometimes Hooting Mandrill, stuff like that, but sometimes making sure they have at least 2 cards in their graveyard so you can drown the lock like a Jetro Arcanist is super important. All right, keeping forces in. So this is something that I learned the hard way. I think when I played Snow, I think very often post board I cut like all the Force of Wolves against so many matchups. When I play like Snow Mirrors, I don't really want Force of Wolves. When I play against Delver, I don't really want Force of Wolves. This deck, it's a completely different story, right? Like everything we've discussed so far, Toxic Deluge is an all-in sweeper. It's not like Dead of Winter. If your Toxic Deluge gets Force of Will, you're basically dead. So you have to be able to fight back. And I think one of the key concepts of playing this deck is trading your cards in the early game, or like being able to convert the cards in your hand for velocity or tempo, right? So force willing a Thalia, or like force willing a random card that hampers you, I think is particularly important. And I've discussed enough about how Force of Will is just so much better in this deck compared to Force Negation that I won't have to say much. Don't board out your Force of Wills if you can help it. Like in most tempo matchups, I actually really like this card. I think it's good, even though you could get Pyroblasted, just because it's like a safety valve, to prevent you from getting cheesed. All right, next, Leovold and Dak Faden. I think this is also pretty self-explanatory. If your opponent has like, I don't know, 4 cards in their hand and you have a Leovold and a Dak Faden, don't target them. It's not worth it. I think letting your opponent see more cards from their deck is generally just not where you want to be, because digging your opponent out of whatever problem they have is one of the ways that you lose the game, because helping your opponent cantrip is bad. If they can remove the Leovold in response to the deck activation, you basically missed out on being able to see more of your own cards. And I think, like I said, right, like a lot of the deck is kind of trying to play your own game and trying to make sure you can get to a point where you have enough mana, you have enough cards in your hand to kind of play out, or like I guess grind it out with your opponent in the late game. And plussing deck on yourself helps you get there. So it's very rare, I think, that you want to plus on your opponent. Obviously, Notion Thief is different. It's not a Leovold, right? They don't actually draw anything, so it's completely different. And yeah, finally, of course, remember the snake. So this is something that I think I see a lot of people who try the deck miss because they don't play companion very often. But remember to put the snake in your hand. It's a genuine play to spend 3 mana to put it in your hand. I think when you have nothing to do, which is pretty often, or if you have a bunch of Force Wolves, it's a good time to pick it up. And I loot this card away more than I should probably, but having in your hand to like pitch a Dak Faden or just like drawing a blue card, I think is good in some number of matchups. All right, and with that, I think we've kind of gone to the end. So this is where you can reach us. This is Chase, obviously, and this is me. Sometimes I stream on completely random days. and Chase streams every Sunday at least. He's been streaming a lot more on weekdays now, so I don't know if that's gonna continue throughout next year. But yeah, this is basically where you can find all of us. This is the 4-color Discord where we basically talk about the deck. I think if you are interested, we basically talk about stuff here in 4-color control check pile. So if you join us, we're super friendly. Yeah, and I think this Discord is, in my opinion, one of the more progressive ones. People aren't afraid to try crazy things, which I think is really cool. We've talked about like so many weird cards. I think like Torpor Orb, we talked about like even before people start playing it. And we basically try everything, and I think that's really cool, right? Like, because we're playing like such a I don't really want to call this a rogue deck, because it is like a known quantity, but the deck is so flexible that you can basically play anything, and you can justify playing any card as long as, you know, it's in our colors and it doesn't involve like tapping a Tundra. So yeah, I mean, with that, I think that's all. Obviously, this video has gone on way too long, but I hope that this is a good primer, and I hope that it's not too long-winded. Yeah, but thank you for watching. Hopefully I've put some good information out there.